Today, we're going to be talking about Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, and we have a whole lot we want to get into, so let's get started. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. We're going to be talking about Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. But before we get into that, I would like for you to please help us as we are participating in an experiment to see if we can grow our channel from virtually no subscribers to 1 million subscribers in just 1 year. So please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and make sure you hit the notification bell to keep up to date with all of the daily content that we're posting on this channel. Today, we're going to be talking about Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. And let me just say, as I begin this video, I'm absolutely fascinated by Robert Greene. I think he's an incredible thinker, and I think he does a great job, even though I do disagree with him on a few fundamental issues. I do think he does a great job capturing what many would see as the complexities of living in this world as it currently exists. And so I want to applaud him for his intentional efforts to actually think deeply about life and the way that we are to approach our lives. Now, with that being said, I think there are some things that Robert Greene gets completely wrong, and it's for a few important and fundamental errors in the way that he thinks about the world. One of the things that's fascinating about this book is that it accepts the premise that individuals seek power, and that individuals in seeking power are trying to obtain an element of success. The thing that is interesting about the pursuit of power is that it requires an individual to exercise authority and power over other individuals. This means one's power must be achieved at the expense of another person's power. Now, fundamentally, as a Christian, I find terrible flaws and errors in that way of thinking. And the unfortunate thing is that this is technically how the world operates. The world operates on the law of power, which states one must achieve a greater power over another in order to achieve their goals and be successful. And this is why Robert Greene's book is so interesting. Robert views the world from two different perspectives, or maybe I should say he sees an individual having two different perspectives in which they might live their lives. The first would be an idealist view, meaning we know how the world should operate. The world should be all good, morally upright. There should be laws of goodness that a person lives by. And that should be the way that we, embrace the way we interact with one another and the way we treat one another. But then he also states that that's technically just not the way the world is. And a person that would rather live in idealism rather than in reality, which is the second option or perspective that he proposes, well, that person who lives in idealism, they're going to be weak, and then they're going to be overcome by the realist who understands the world is dark and it is complex and things don't go the way they should. And we should just get on with it and make sure we do whatever we can do to survive and thrive in a less than ideal situation. Now, the interesting thing about this perspective is the fact that it is really based on Nietzsche's will to power. The idea or the philosophy, the will to power, simply states that one must overcome themselves and whatever oppositions that lie in their way in order to accomplish their greatest success. Furthermore, it states that this is an ongoing battle. So it's not like one day we accomplish the success or we overcome whatever the obstacle is. It's really an ongoing effort to overcome things, ourselves, people, circumstances, situations. And so when you take in that idea, that framework, and you couple it with Greene's idea of 48 Laws of Power, then you can kind of wrap your mind on where he's going and why he is going in this direction. Now, there are 4 things that I think Robert Greene gets wrong about his view on life. And they are fundamental because as a Christian, I think, based on the example that I see in Jesus Christ, that it is completely immoral and unacceptable to accumulate and to acquire power on the basis or at the expense of someone else losing their power. I personally don't feel as a Christian that we have been given the authorization or even the right to exercise authority over other individuals in a way that will leave them less fortunate than they were when we interacted with them. And many people might think that's just a too nice way to live. and that a person in that framework or in that mindset, they're weak and they're just simply doomed for, some sort of failure. But I argue, based on my convictions of Scripture and the example of Jesus Christ, which is probably the most convicting thing out of the two, I argue that there is success found in the example that is lived by Jesus Christ, rather than the philosophies that we find in individuals like Robert Greene and Friedrich Nietzsche. So the first thing I find as a critical issue is the way Greene views the world. He has somewhat of a skewed view of the world, which we talked about earlier. That is the idealist view versus the realist view. And he opts to be a realist rather than living in idealism. Well, the issue is this is birthed out of personal observation, which means at the very onset, it's just a theory. That doesn't make it altogether true or absolute in any way, form, or fashion, but it's typically viewed as true because so many people can relate to the phenomenon. It's kind of like with Martin Luther, who had an issue with his own personal salvation, which was relatable to many other people, which made societies feel that it was absolute. Well, not everyone had the struggle that Martin Luther had, and I'm sure there were some people that looked at him and said, your circumstance, your experiences are specific to your own life, and it doesn't apply to me. But when you have such a large group of people who can associate with or relate to things such as, yes, in actuality, we do try to live great in this world and live morally in this world, but it seems as if we get walked all over, then you find that these ideas and these theories become absolute. And it leads to certain conclusions and even proposed solutions that may not be within the proper or the best interest of the whole, or even at times the individuals who are using them. The second issue that I find with Greene's view of the world, that is, one must use darkness to overcome darkness, use manipulation to overcome manipulation, be more craftier than the craftiest. It's this kind of idea where we got to outwit the wittiest. And so the problem with this view is the fact that it is incredibly individualistic. So whenever you view the world in the way that Greene is viewing it, you're viewing the world from the perspective that says it's about what I can personally get out of this. And as a Christian, it's very hard to be individualistic and also a follower of Jesus Christ. The unfortunate thing is that many Christians tend to live individualistically, which is why we may not find it abnormal to see many Christians following the views and the perspectives and even the laws of this book that Robert Greene proposes. It's very interesting. The thing that we're going to look at in the future is the kind of things that Robert Greene puts in this book and how common the practice of these laws are, even amongst your most noble Christians. And the only way that can happen is if you have an individualistic view of the world and you live your life through individualistic efforts to better your own life, even at the expense of your neighbor, which, by the way, is a huge violation of the example that we see in Jesus Christ. The third thing that I find as a serious flaw in the way that Greene views the world is the assumption that there is some sort of false morality. Greene argues that individuals often try to take this perspective or this role that says it's immoral to live this way. And really, their attempt to justify their own morality is a means of them trying to, in some way, acquire the power that they're craving in a way that is indirect and besides the one that he proposes, or the way that he proposes that power should be received. He states that when a person uses this sort of moral argument, what they should do is just admit that you want power and you're trying to do it in a way that makes you feel good about not being as dark as you should be in trying to obtain this power. And so he concludes that that's not real morality, that's false morality. Well, in essence, the question we have to answer is whether or not one can be purely moral and obtain true power. And really, in answering that question, what we have to do is define what our power is for And what does it mean to have real power? I think those are two things that we need to really have a conversation about when we're talking about the differences in the view that Robert Greene may hold and the view that a Christian following after the example of Jesus Christ would hold. What does it mean to have power, and what should we do with it when we get it? Those two questions are critical to understanding whether or not there's a such thing as true morality in the pursuit of having power. Now, I must say, I do agree with Greene. Humans do crave power, but we need to understand how should we crave that power? Why should we crave that power? And what should we do with it when we get it? And the last thing that I disagree with Robert Greene on, and I think is a huge flaw, and it's probably the biggest flaw in the way that he views the world, it is the fact that there is an absence of God. You see, when we talk about acquiring power, and we talk about using power, we must consider that we, in our obtaining of power or acquisition of power, are simply stewards of the power that we are borrowing from someone else besides ourselves. And that someone else is not other individuals. But as a Christian, I don't think that I have a complete hold on power to do whatsoever I would like to do with it. As a Christian, I'm thinking in my own self that my use of power is a means of managing the resource of power that has been given to me by a higher power to do with it what he wants me to do with that power. And if I remove God from the equation, then it simply becomes a competition between other individuals who have the right to hold power in an equal way that I can hold power to do whatever they want to do with it. So what does that create? It creates confrontation, and it makes it a war among supposed equals to who can leverage the power that they have to obtain more power. You see, when God is taken out of the equation, then the world becomes dark. Yes, it is dark, but the problem is when God is not in the equation, there's really no true solution. There's really no way to overcome darkness. So you try to manage your way through it. You don't necessarily overcome it. As Nietzsche would say, you're in a continual battle with those struggles that try to disrupt your power. But when God is in the equation, when there is a higher power, you submit yourself to the higher power and whatever virtues he says you should have in order to obtain whatever the appropriate amount of power needed for you to successfully complete the missions and the objections that he has for you. It's a very complex thing, but the absence of God makes this whole idea that Robert Greene has actually sensible in some respects. But if God is truly in the world and he's operating, he's involved, then you find it very difficult to live by these 48 laws of power, at least some of them. And you find it difficult to see the world the way Robert Greene sees it. When Jesus came into the world and he talked about the challenge of overcoming darkness, overcoming the complexities of this world, John talked about Jesus in a way that I think brings some solution and some answers to even some of the questions that Robert Greene presented about how he was wrestling with the complexities of the world and the way the world operates. And in John chapter 1, verse 5, here's the premise that he gives us. Yes, the world is dark. There's a dark world, meaning the world is controlled by evil forces, evil personalities. There are all sorts of things that get in the way of people who are trying to use power in the right way. But when you look in scripture, the answer to overcoming darkness is not more darkness. The answer to overcoming darkness is actually light. And this is what John says in chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. The darkness can never overpower it or overcome it. You see, if Jesus was living today and he was wrestling with the questions that Robert Greene is wrestling with, and quite frankly, many of us are wrestling with today, the idea that we can never get ahead because there's so much darkness, Jesus' solution would not be what Robert Greene said. It would not be use a greater darkness to overcome darkness. Jesus would say, use light to overcome darkness. When light is being shined, or when there's light in the room, or light in a situation, or light in a world, darkness cannot overcome it, overpower it, or extinguish it. And that light that is being spoken of is the light of moral excellence, the light of virtue, living by the example of Jesus Christ, when we live in that light and when that light is shined through us, we find a way to overcome the darkness in the world. And that's when we begin to find answers to the questions that Robert Greene is thinking about very, very intently. But the problem is he's thinking about these questions without the presence of God. And that is where he finds all sorts of inconsistencies. And quite frankly, there's really no solution because you never stop fighting. You're always fighting. You're always trying to get more power. But when you are using light to overcome darkness, well, you don't have to really fight because darkness cannot extinguish light. The thing I want us to think about as we consider these very difficult issues is when we think about living in the world and executing power or obtaining power even, what is the way in which we should embrace our lives? Should we, by all means, use manipulation and strategy and try to get over on everyone as much as we possibly can? Or is there a better way to be powerful? I would conclude and I would argue that Jesus has given us a way to be powerful by mastering oneself and not trying to master others or dominate others. I think the key to being powerful, based on what we see in Jesus Christ, is having power over oneself as to defeat the intentions and the desire and even the craving to dominate other people at the expense of acquiring more power for ourselves. I think that is the key to being a powerful person. And we see that in Jesus Christ, who was the most humble servant that you could ever find. And that word may get a lot of people in trouble. That may be a dirty word to some people, the word humility and the word servant, but it is the way to really living in this world when you understand God actually does exist.